Science can be done in many, many different ways. One potential way that science can be done is just through good luck, such as Newton's gravity ideas. He kept observing things falling, and he was right that there was a force there of attraction. You can use the scientific method. You can actually go into the field to do studies, so we call those field studies. And the fourth way, there's other ways to do science that are less common, and so they just get grouped into this category of others. So let's talk about the scientific method, because that's what we've been taught from a super young age. So there are 7 steps to the scientific method. The first one is to identify a research question or observe some sort of problem that needs to be solved. Then you form a hypothesis, gather your evidence. Another word for evidence would be data. And then you analyze that evidence. And then you decide whether the evidence supports your hypothesis or not, which then allows you to draw conclusions. And then lastly, you communicate your results. So probably the most important thing for you to realize is that these steps can be done in a different order. Some steps could be skipped, or they could be repeated. So remember a couple of videos ago we talked about misconceptions. One big misconception is that there is only one scientific method. And that's just not true. Each scientist is going to use these steps however many times they need to, in whatever order they need to, that best fits the type of research they are doing. This is also a very oversimplified process, because science is so complex that these steps don't always fit the process or the investigation that is taking place. So when we look at these steps of the scientific investigation, it shows us starting with a problem or having a question, and then you form your hypothesis. You could either make some observations, test your hypothesis, and form experiments. Then you take your data, you organize it, you analyze it, and then you figure out if your hypothesis was supported, yes or no. If lucky you, it worked out, you get to draw your conclusions and then communicate your results. However, if your data does not support your hypothesis, you have to reevaluate your experiment. Was there issues with the experiment? Were there flaws? Where were the problems? And then you get to try new experiments, which then brings you back to new data. So let's look at these steps of the scientific method in a little more detail now. So the first step is to ask questions, and your questions are going to be based on observations. And an observation is any information that you gather with your senses. So remember, your senses are 5 senses: sight, hearing, smell, touch, and taste. So we are going to look at this example that deals with this bracelet. So Tara has a bracelet with a magnetic clasp, which is right here. She has noticed that the 2 magnets in the clasp feel harder to pull apart on cold days than on warm days. She wonders whether the temperature affects the strength of the magnet. So these observations are based on her sense of touch when it comes to her sensation of how hard it is to pull the magnets apart, and feeling of cold versus warm. So then the next step is to form a hypothesis, and this is a potential answer to a question that can be tested by gathering information. So when you write a hypothesis, it has to be possible to gather the evidence. So for example, Tara hypothesizes that a magnet is stronger at lower temperatures. This is based on her observations. So then from this hypothesis, she can make a prediction. If she cools a magnet, then it will pick up more metal objects because it would then be stronger. The strength of a magnet would allow it to pick up more objects. So this brings us to the idea that some questions cannot be answered by science because we don't have any evidence gathered by our senses to answer those questions. So evidence taken in by observation is experimented on by a scientist. This separates legitimate sciences from other things. We call those pseudoscience. And if you remember from way back in 7th grade, the prefix pseudo, we used it with the word pseudopod for fake foot with starfish. Or not starfish, sorry. With protists. And so if we have pseudopods, meaning fake foot, pseudoscience would then mean fake science. Scientific conclusions cannot be formed if a person cannot gather data through some sort of instrument or sense information, and there is no way to prove a hypothesis is false. And so if you cannot disprove or not support a hypothesis, you can't use science to back up your claim. So once you have a testable hypothesis written, you can perform your experiment. The experiment is a controlled scientific study of limited number of variables. There must be at least 2 variables, 2 things that are different. So we have the independent variable. Your book actually calls this a manipulated variable. We've referred to it as the independent variable since we've talked about this in previous years. This is the factor that gets changed by the scientist or the experimenter. And so Tara will change the temperature of the magnet, so that's your independent variable. The dependent variable is also called the responding variable because it responds to the independent variable or the change in that independent variable. This is the factor in an experiment that is expected to change or respond when the manipulated variable changes. So the number of paper clips attracted by the magnet should change as Tara changes the temperature. Let's change this to a constant. Oh my goodness, if I can spell it. So a constant is a variable in the experiment that is obviously held the same or constant, so it will not influence the outcome. And so an example of this would we would want to make sure that the size and the shape of the magnet doesn't change. She could also make sure to control the size and shape of the paper clips. So when she does her experiment before she cools the magnet down, she can't change the size or the shape of the paper clips from that experiment to after for when she cools the magnet down. Those paper clips need to stay the same for both sets of experiment. So then we have the control, which is the original set of conditions. So when I was talking about how before she cools the magnet down and she uses a room temperature magnet, that would be the control, because that gives us a baseline, some data, some baseline data. So sometimes experiments are not possible or desirable to do. So you can't bring a distant star into a science lab and do a bunch of experiments on it. So that means scientists have to do field studies, and this is where they investigate a problem in a real world setting. The investigation, so like the investigating the effects of farming practices on water quality. You're not going to get any type of farm pollutants in water that doesn't come from agricultural areas. So you actually have to go to those agricultural areas and get water samples there. So when you get your experiment done, you've collected your data, you've analyzed it, and now you need to communicate it. So the pros of communicating your results is you get feedback from other scientists, and it allows other scientists to repeat your investigation. This replication is getting the same results when an investigation is repeated. This gives your original experiment validation. Results are more likely to be correct if they are able to be replicated. So if I do an experiment and get one result, and then the next person does my experiment and gets the same result, that's good. Whereas if person A and person B do the same experiment and get two different results, that doesn't mean that the results are valid. They would need to continue to research that. So one way a hypothesis may eventually become a theory is by having all of these scientists replicate the scientific experiments, and they get the same results every time. Every time this experiment is done, the result is the same. And so that's when a hypothesis can become a theory. So scientists share the results in many different ways. They can publish their findings in their experimental process in peer-reviewed scientific journals. And so a scientific journal or a peer-reviewed means a bunch of scientists look at the articles to make sure that the scientific evidence in these articles are valid and ethical, and then they get published. They can present their findings at conferences and meetings. They can create websites to show off what they've done. And they could write articles for newspapers or magazines. Basically, you just got to get your word out there. So I brought up ethics on the previous slide. And ethics are basic rules for deciding between right and wrong. And the thing with ethics is that each individual has a different set of ethics that they tend to follow. When we do scientific research, there are some ethical rules that all scientists try to follow. So the first rule would be that their scientific research is reported honestly. They can't make up data. They can't make up conclusions that are not supported by their data. Wrong and misleading to make up or change the results to make them seem correct would also be unethical. You must see things as they really are. You need to avoid being biased by the results that they want or expected. So even if you get results that you didn't expect or that didn't fall in line with your hypothesis, you have to report what you really found, even if you're wrong. You have to work meticulously and carefully to avoid errors. When you study human subjects, the subjects must be told of any potential risk, and they have the right to refuse to participate. You have to inform any coworkers, students, and members of the community about any risks of research, and you can only proceed if the group consents. So some of the teachers here have done some master's degree programs where they have to collect data about their students, and every time that happens, they have sent home a letter of consent to be signed by your parents to make sure that it's okay that they collect data on you and then report their findings. When studying animals, they must be treated humanely, provide for their needs, and do everything possible to avoid harming them. And so this is why I know in 7th grade we talked about cloning Dolly the sheep. And so cloning is one of those areas of science that some find unethical because it results and it has resulted in many animal deaths. And so ethics can be a very tricky thing. So scientists can help people make ethical decisions in their own lives. So for example, science has shown that human actions are affecting Earth's climate and that driving cars are causing Earth to get warmer. And so the science has provided this information. And so now it is up to us as individuals to look at if it is unethical to drive a car to work or school. So some of those things that you could think about would be how close to school do you live? How far from school do you live? You have to weigh the pros and cons of each of these kind of situations, and each individual could come up with their own answer, and it should be based on their own situation. So science is much more than just the scientific investigation or the scientific method. It really incorporates human ethical decisions and right and wrong as well.